Hi, Nino. It's so good to see you, and thank you for slipping out of the courtroom today to talk to us.
Hi, Reged.
Now, this trial is really just getting underway. We're only in week 2, and we're talking to you to get a sense of how it's been in that first week or so. There's been so much intense interest. Can you just give me an idea of what it's been like in the courtroom and describe the scene for us?
Yeah, so our listeners may not know, but Morwell's a fairly small town in the Latrobe Valley, sort of southeast of Melbourne. And this is a courtroom that would typically hear much less serious charges than, a triple murder allegations and an attempted murder allegation like we're hearing in this case. So there's also been quite a build-up to it, given that the allegations here occurred in 2023. So it's fair to say that when this trial started early last week, there was an enormous kind of release of all that build-up. There were at least sort of 25, almost 30 reporters there. There were camera crews all around outside the court. There were, multiple photographers. There's, people working on all sorts of projects, from those, daily news blogs to people working on, long form documentaries and the like. So it's been quite, unprecedented in terms of the sort of court cases I've covered over my career so far.
That's a lot of journalists at one court case. Let's get into some of the details as you've been hearing them. We'll start with the prosecution. Now, they've presented their arguments against Erin Patterson. What case have they been making?
So they've made it quite clear that they have to prove that Erin Patterson intended to cause the death or serious injury of her 4 lunch guests. And they're saying that it's not in dispute that she deliberately poisoned them with death cap mushrooms, that she prepared beef Wellingtons that contained these mushrooms, and that she knew she was doing it. She intended to do it, and that it was a voluntary act. So what's been really interesting, I suppose, is that Erin Patterson isn't denying that that's what happened to her guests, that they were poisoned with death cap mushrooms. What she's saying is that, no, I didn't mean to do that. But the prosecutor, Nanette Rogers, has also sort of said in her opening submissions that Patterson invited her estranged husband Simon along, that his relatives were the ones that actually attended that guest, that Simon didn't come, and that the reason for that lunch was that she wanted to discuss medical issues and how to break those to the kids. Now, it also emerged in that opening address from prosecutor Nanette Rogers SC that Erin told those guests that she had ovarian cancer, but she wasn't ever diagnosed with cancer. And the apparent reason for the lunch, or the reason Erin told people the lunch was going to happen, is because she wanted to discuss how to break that news to her and Simon's 2 children. The prosecution say Erin Patterson concocted this entire story about having cancer, and that was to ensure that her children weren't present for the lunch.
So these are the prosecution's opening statements. What other kind of evidence did they reveal as they made their case?
Yeah, so early on in the opening address, and we probably should point out here for the audience that this is the prosecution sort of summing up their case. It's not necessarily the evidence itself, but it's what they say the evidence is. But they said, look, Patterson's phone records suggest that she twice visited areas where death cap mushrooms had been reportedly discovered. They say that her phone records suggest that she travelled to these 2 sort of small locales near her house, and that those visits corresponded with public posts on a website known as iNaturalist, which is typically used to upload observations of that people have seen in the wild. And these particular posts were about death cap mushrooms being found and contained very specific information about their location, the prosecution said. The prosecutor, Nanette Rogers SC, also said that Patterson told police she'd never owned a food dehydrator nor dehydrated food. But she'd been sharing photos of that dehydrator, Rogers said, and her habit of using it to dehydrate mushrooms with friends on Facebook. And there was also some CCTV footage that showed Patterson actually dumping that dehydrator at a local tip. And when that was, forensically analysed after it was seized by police, it had her fingerprints on it and contained traces of death cap mushrooms. And what Rogers, the prosecutor, mentioned in her opening address was that disposal of the dehydrator had been done because Patterson wanted to conceal her actions.
We do know that Erin Patterson says she also became ill from the meal. So how does the prosecution explain that?
Yeah, so the courts heard that Erin Patterson did go to Leongatha Hospital saying she was suffering from diarrhoea, but later discharged herself against medical advice. She returned to hospital later that day, but the prosecution alleges that Patterson hadn't actually eaten the same lunch as her guests and was effectively pretending to have the same type of illness as them to cover this up. What she also did was tell the doctors at the hospital that she'd served the leftovers of that meal to her children, but had actually scraped the mushrooms off. Now, the doctors at the hospital basically said, look, you've got to get these kids in. We've got 4 people that are really gravely ill from this lunch. We need to take them in to be monitored and potentially for treatment. And the prosecution say that when Erin was told this by the doctors, she basically became really upset and insisted they didn't need to be taken out of school and assessed like the doctors wanted, and she preferred to keep them there. And the prosecutors, again, are sort of alleging that that's a bit of an indicator that Erin knew the kids weren't actually going to be unwell because she knew that they had not eaten the same food as the rest of her lunch guests.
So that's some of what the prosecution is saying, some of their main points. Let's have a look at the other side now. Erin Patterson has pleaded not guilty, and her lawyer says it was a tragic accident. So how does her lawyer argue in her defence?
Yeah, her barrister, Colin Mandy SC, says this poisoning was a tragic accident, and he sort of goes further than that to explain that once Patterson realised the extent of this tragic accident, that she then lied to cover up what had happened. That basically, she panicked. And, one of the things he said to the jury was, quote, "Is it possible that people might do and say things that are not well thought out and might in the end make them look bad? Is it possible a person might lie when they find out people are gravely ill because of food they served up?" And he was specifically referring to lies about owning the dehydrator and also lying to police about having never foraged for mushrooms. But he did make really clear to the jury when he was admitting that Erin had told these lies that she denied deliberately seeking out death cap mushrooms.
As you said earlier, the prosecution did say that Erin Patterson wasn't honest about her cancer diagnosis. So what does her defence say about that?
So Colin Mandy SC for Patterson also says that she has never been diagnosed with cancer. He hasn't necessarily gone any further than that, explained the reason for the lunch, but he's agreed that she never had cancer.
So during this whole time, Erin Patterson is sitting in the courtroom listening and watching to what's being said about her. Can you give us a sense of her demeanour and reactions at the beginning of this trial?
Yeah, I should probably just give our audience a bit of a visual picture of what that courtroom is actually like. So as you walk into the room, the jury box is to the right, the witness box is to the left, the judge sits in between those, sort of on an elevated sort of platform looking over the whole court, and Erin is sitting in the dock at the rear of the court. So what that means is that all the public seats are facing the judge, and so basically Erin is directly behind all of us, including the reporters. And so if we want to gauge how she's reacting to proceedings, we sort of have to turn around to look at her. And often she turns and meets our eyes. But, that's obviously a little bit of an awkward way to kind of monitor how people are behaving in court. But we have noticed that she's been emotional a number of times. Generally, that's been when there's been discussion about her lunch guests or her children. There's been some instances where she appeared to sort of shake her head at certain parts of evidence. But for the most part, she appeared to my eye to basically be watching really intently. Sort of, she tends to blink quite rapidly when she sort of will stare at something, but she'll be blinking quite rapidly as she does so. She generally has her chin raised slightly as if listening, and her mouth kind of downturned in a fairly sort of unemotive fashion. But yeah, she has appeared emotional at times, particularly emotional when her estranged husband, Simon, was speaking about the closeness of of her relationship with his parents, particularly his father, Don.
You just mentioned her estranged husband, Simon, there. Let's talk about him because he was the first witness called. So tell us about what Simon Patterson had to say, firstly, about their relationship.
Yeah, so Simon basically went over the entire history of their relationship, from marrying in 2007 after meeting at a city council where they both worked and were part of the same eclectic group of friends, to separating numerous times between their marriage in 2007 and late 2015, and the fact that they sort of were sharing parenting of their two children, aged 9 and 14, over that period. And also, I suppose, that even though that separation in late 2015 was described as the final separation, that there was this sense that they may reconcile, that they stayed friendly, that they'd go on holiday with their children together still despite being separated. You know, Simon said that Erin was very intelligent, that was one of the things that attracted him to her in the first place, was her intelligence, and that, you know, he said, quote, she can be quite witty and quite funny. He basically said that Erin had a real interest in lots of different things, that she'd studied various courses and things like that, and while also sort of, you know, performing duties as at home and looking after the children. He, you know, I suppose sort of admitted that every time there was those separations, that it was Erin leaving him and leaving the relationship, and it was maybe him who was trying to reconcile a little more than her. And, you know, at one point he became particularly emotional and asked for tissues and said, quote, it's good to be friends with the person you're married to. But he also said that their relationship sort of in late 2022, so in the kind of year immediately before the lunch, that the relationship had become strained and there was some tension in that relationship.
Did he explain why the relationship had become strained?
Yeah, so Simon explained that basically he'd had a miscommunication with his accountant, which had resulted in him being listed as separated on his tax return. And that was the first time that had happened, even though they'd been separated for about 7 years at that point. And he said that basically created a dispute with Erin over family tax benefits, and that she said she would have to pursue child support. And he actually said that she became, quote, extremely aggressive about that. Eventually, that child support payment was allocated as $38 a month, which he admitted, you know, created even more friction because it was clear that wasn't enough. They basically kept having these ongoing disagreements in relation to this issue, a lot of which were actually brought out in court by reference to text messages they'd shared, including in a Signal group chat with Simon's parents. And, you know, Simon in particular talked about some messages he described as very inflammatory. He agreed with Patterson's lawyer that sort of relationship had descended into pettiness, and that he being Simon, had to sought the assistance of a mediator. And yeah, he basically said that started to infect other parts of the relationship as well. So there was a pub lunch that had been organised for his mother Gail's 70th birthday. Erin felt that she hadn't been properly invited to that, and that when the invite did come, it was an afterthought. And so those sort of messages, I suppose, were picked over in quite a lot of detail to kind of paint a bigger picture of what that relationship was like in sort of late 2022. So we're talking about 8 months roughly before the lunch itself.
Well, let's move forward to the day of the lunch in question. What did Simon Patterson tell us about that?
Yeah, so Simon said it was quite rare for Patterson to invite guests over to the family home. He said that on the Sunday at the Currumbara Baptist Church, where they would go to Sunday service, Erin usually went every fortnight, and that about 2 weeks prior to that, he was invited by Erin to the lunch, and Erin also invited Ian and Heather Wilkinson. Ian was the pastor at that particular church, and also Don and Gail Patterson. He agreed to go at the time, but the night before he texted her to say he felt uncomfortable, and that he'd be happy to speak with her at a later date. Remember that Erin had told everybody the purpose for that lunch was to discuss a serious health issue. So he sort of mentioned that in his text to her, saying, look, happy to just talk about this later. And Simon was asked in court about Erin's reply. And in her text, she said she was really disappointed he wasn't coming, that she'd spent, quote, many hours this week preparing lunch, and that she had spent, quote, a small fortune on eye-fillet steak to make beef Wellingtons because she wanted a special meal. So Simon said he didn't respond after Erin wrote that to him, and that he'd already told his parents he wouldn't be attending.
So one of the fascinating elements of this start of the trial has been some detail emerging about the colour of plates that the meals were served on to Simon Patterson's family. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Nanette Rogers SC mentioned in her opening statement to the court that it would be alleged that Patterson had served these individual beef Wellingtons, which were that eye-fillet steak covered in mushrooms and wrapped in pastry, on a plate with mashed potato and green beans. What the prosecution are saying is that the guests were served on 4 large grey plates, and that Patterson herself had a smaller, lighter coloured plate. So all the lunch guests started to feel unwell about 11 or 12 hours later, and Simon Patterson was actually asked about a conversation the prosecution say he had with his aunt during that visit. So Simon's gone over to their house. He's realised they're really unwell from this meal. She apparently looked puzzled and said she noticed Erin served her own food on a coloured plate, which was different to the rest of their plates. And she actually apparently brought this up again, Simon said in his evidence, during their transportation to hospital. She asked Simon if Erin was short on crocker, and he replied that yes, Erin didn't have many plates.
So Simon Patterson also visited his parents. They were being treated in hospital because they were unwell too. How did he describe their situation?
He said his dad was a lot worse than his mum, and that his father was really struggling. He said that his father, Don, was lying on his side. He was hunched. He had a really discoloured face and was struggling to speak with a sort of strained voice. He described him, quote, as not right inside, that he was feeling the pain, and he became emotional several times during this particular piece of evidence. In Simon's evidence, he was also asked about whether Erin had been inquiring after the health of his lunch guests, and he said that he thought it was odd that she didn't inquire. She didn't ask about how they were going. But Erin Patterson's lawyer, Colin Mandy, put it to him that she did actually ask about the health of his guests, as when they were in hospital together, Erin was hearing part of his phone conversations, and it was in this context that Simon got off the phone and Erin sort of said, oh, how are they going? But Simon was very insistent in his evidence before the court that he didn't recall Erin asking about the lunch guests. And he also denied that he asked Erin in reference to the dehydrator, is that what you used to poison them? And this was within days of that particular lunch.
We also heard from some other witnesses, maybe a sign of the times, but Erin Patterson's Facebook friends, a couple of them, have been giving evidence in court. That was on Monday. And they revealed some details about what she told them about her estranged relationship with her husband.
Yeah, so we heard from 3 Facebook friends of Erin Patterson. They met on what they described as a true crime group dedicated to the Kelly Lane case. And they said basically they'd never actually met Erin in person, and that they, pretty much met up in this larger group, formed smaller groups. Eventually it became basically a private chat of about half a dozen of them or so. And one of those particular friends, Christine Hunt, told the court that although she hadn't met Erin, they became quite close, and that Erin had confided various things about her relationship with Simon. She described him as coercive, and that described his parents as demanding. She sort of spoke to Hunt about challenges with their faith and the fact that she was an atheist, whereas Simon and his family were Baptist. Daniela Barkley, another one of these Facebook friends, said that there were various concerns she had about the relationship too, including that Erin felt that Simon was favouring one of their children over another, and that he wasn't a very nice person was apparently the impression she got from what Erin was saying. But Erin did tell all this group that she loved mushrooms, that she was using a dehydrator to dehydrate mushrooms and hiding them in things that she was cooking for her children, including brownies. And she also discussed in that Facebook group cooking beef Wellington and her plans to do that.
Well, the trial still has a long way to go, and we'll obviously hear more as the weeks go on. But what surprised me is the prosecution is saying that they aren't going to try and prove that there's a motive.
Yeah, so might be a bit of a surprise to people, but that's not actually something the prosecution have to do when they're attempting to secure a conviction for murder. They don't have to tell the court what they think was the purpose for this happening. And, Nanette Rogers, SC, the prosecutor, actually said to the jury, quote, "You might still be wondering this at the end of the trial, but motive is not something that has to be proven by the prosecution. You do not have to be satisfied what the motive was, or even if there was one." So the other thing that I think is really important to sort of consider here, and it's something that the judge, Justice Christopher Beale, actually said to the jury, is there's two key things that he implored that jury to consider when they're hearing all the evidence in this case. And that is, did Erin Patterson intend to put the mushrooms in those beef Wellingtons? And did she intend to kill or seriously injure her lunch guests when she did that? And he said that is effectively that they're the two things that jury should grapple with. And he acknowledged there's lots of overlapping parts here, but he basically said, when you're listening to the evidence, consider those two things.
We're going to hear a lot more about that as the weeks go on. We're currently recording on Tuesday morning. Do we know what witness will come up next?
We're expecting to hear on Tuesday from Ian Wilkinson, the only surviving lunch guest other than Erin Patterson. After him, we have another 5 weeks or so scheduled for this trial, so there's still going to be a lot to play out. The jury was given a list of about 160 names of people involved in the case. Some of them were people that were judges and on the court staff, but the rest of them were prospective witnesses. So there's still a lot to go in this trial.
We are really at the beginning. Nino, no doubt we're going to come back to you again as the trial goes on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.